My dad takes story time very seriously. Part 1 point. Probably the earliest memories I have of my life are story time. Dad would sit in his special seat in his room, and I'd sit cross-legged on the floor. Story time was important. Story time was special. Story time couldn't be skipped. Every night. It was a ritual, an event. I liked it. Mostly. He'd often read from picture books. He'd always shuffle in new ones. Stories about animals, leaves, gremlins, ghouls, talking clouds, all that good stuff. As a young kid, I didn't realize just how weird it was for him to have so many darn kids' books at his disposal. Anyways, there was one important rule that always came with his nightly storytelling. Whenever he shared a tale, I wasn't allowed to get distracted. In the earlier years, it felt like he was much more lax about this. If I yawned or dozed off, he was pretty forgiving. But if I interrupted him, saying I was hungry or bored or wanted to play video games, he'd shut me down quickly. He'd stare at me from his chair, an intense, angry glare. Then, with my full attention, he'd simply say, "What would the uninvited guest think about this?" Naturally, I didn't have a great answer to this question. At first, I assumed it was just an expression akin to saying it's raining cats and dogs. Some phrase that sounded like nonsense, but one that I'd understand when I was older. Either way, I ended up becoming a pretty good listener after months of this ritual, and started to really relish these moments with my dad. The stories themselves were boring, sure, but he'd always work hard to spice them up with great pacing and impassioned voice acting. It wasn't until I turned 9 that his story time rules became much stricter. At this point, if I got itchy and looked down at my arm to scratch it, he'd snap his fingers, then glare. What would the uninvited guests think about this? If I noticed a snowfall happening outside, my eyes briefly darting to the window, it would be another snap of his fingers, another disapproving look, and another mention of uninvited visitors. I'd even learned to stare right at him, nodding intently at the appropriate story. Beats while my mind was off wandering about something else. Still, he'd somehow be able to catch it.